This is the Wailing Wall at the, is there a pointer?
Yeah, the very top is a laser pointer.
Yeah. This is the Wailing Wall, and this is what it's like at the Wailing Wall on one of the holy days. Whoop, whoop, whoop. I assume that's back. Hey, I get the hang of things pretty quick. Okay. So here we go. This is,
The Temple Mount.
that is the so-called Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives. This is looking, an aerial view, of course, looking south. This is the Dome of the Rock, and this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Dome of the Rock is a golden domed structure. And this is, I maintain, from Dr. Martin's information, which he began researching in 1995, 96, and 97. First published in a small article in 97, which is still on the website. So that was not where the temple is, but the Haram al-Sharif, also known as the Al-Quds, also known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque platform, which when I presented with Professor George Wesley Buchanan at the Al Maktoum Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies in Scotland, that's how they preferred that I refer to it. Now, the Gihon Spring, in relation to the Haram al-Sharif, or the so-called Temple Mount, is just to the south of the platform. Notice, by the way, that this is not a rectangle. It's not a square, it's not a rectangle. It's a trapezoid. The northern wall is wider than the southern wall. This all information today all comes from Dr. Martin's book, The Temples that Jerusalem Forgot, published in 2000. First, we're going to look at Jesus' statement. His disciples came to Jesus and to show him the buildings of the temple, and Jesus said to them, "There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." And he talked about that in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, and he also said the same thing about the city of Jerusalem in Luke 19. Now Josephus says that this actually happened. Caesar ordered the whole city and the temple to be razed to the ground, as to leave future visitors to the spot no ground for believing that it had ever been inhabited. Josephus, or Eleazar, who was at Masada, died, committed suicide, but there were women who survived the Masada siege. And the women must have reported to Josephus or to the Romans, who then, that's where Josephus' source is. From the Romans, from the women survivors. Jerusalem is now demolished to the very foundations and has nothing but the camp of those that destroyed it, which still dwells upon its ruins. I maintain that it's Fort Antonia. That holy city demolished, the foundations of our holy temple were not just razed to the ground, but the foundations were dug up. Nothing would be left. The city was cast down to its foundations. The temple stones were removed one from another. The temple foundations were dug up. Yet today, when you go there, or as you have seen, there are 5,000 to 8,000 original stones still upon another in place, and above those levels are smaller stones that existed from that time. See this here? That whole section here in the southwest corner, and they've dug a lot farther down, by the way, than this here. Those are the original stones, especially on that southwest corner. And Shikron, at the very base stone, Eli Shikron has found a coin dated after Herod died. But that's a topic for another day. The Haram al-Sharif excavation, this is where they started. Those are about 4 to 5 feet in height, those stones. And they've gone even farther than this here today. Now, was Jesus' prophecy wrong? I asked Dr. Martin that in 1983. I asked him, what are all these stones doing here, one upon another? He said, in that time, oh, that was just how they were built. You know, just down to the ground level. But that's not what Josephus said happened. Or did Jesus lie? No, neither. The Al-Aqsa compound is not the site of the Jewish temples. That's one aspect. The foundations of our holy temple were dug up. You saw how huge those stones are. Were they dug up? No. Josephus lived in Jerusalem for a good portion of his life. He had access to the Roman records, and they gave him all the Jewish records about Herod. Rabbi David Kimke, the Radak, great Jewish commentator, in the 1100s, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque had been there for 500 years. Look what David Kimke says. The temple is still in ruins. The temple site was never built on by the nations. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were two of the great structures of the time in the 1100s in Jerusalem. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Dome of the Rock is on top, Al-Aqsa Mosque is on the bottom. Our holy site, never been this is Azariah de Rossi, this is the last dated Jewish source that we have that Mount Moriah was never built on. Our holy site has not been transformed into a house of prayer for any other people. I assure you, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a house of prayer. And the Dome of the Rock is a house of prayer. And as a matter of fact, it is not a mosque. The Dome of the Rock is not a mosque, it is a shrine. Individuals go there to praise Allah. No Arab would pitch his tent there. This is In the Light of the Eyes, Joanna Weinberg, translator, 2001. 1577. Now note this. The Dome of the Rock was completed in 692 AD. The Al-Aqsa Mosque a few years earlier, 12 years earlier. Now what difference does it make? Well, in the year 2000, Camp David Summit broke up over the issue of the Temple Mount. We'll come back to this later. Ehud Barak, Bill Clinton, and Yasser Arafat. Barak is still alive. Arafat has died. Now, Dr. Ernest Martin. There's a story, it's in the book, about how Dr. Martin came to begin the research. I won't go into it here. But Dr. Martin supervised the students on an archaeological dig for Professor Benjamin Mazar, one of the founders of Hebrew University, well-known archaeologist, for 5 seasons, 1969 to 73. And they started digging it, and they started digging here, and then they worked their way around, and Elat Mazar, Benjamin Mazar's granddaughter, is still digging down here. Dr. Martin got to know all of the Mazar family. Benjamin Mazar, his wife, his son Ori Mazar. Elat Mazar is Ori Mazar's daughter. And Danny Mazar, as well as Ahami Mazar, Professor Benjamin Mazar's nephew. Could you grab me one of those chairs? Okay, great. So, this gives you an idea. Well, you've seen that before. But over here on the Mount of Olives, there are all these graves of Jewish people. And they extend to the left and to the right on the Mount of Olives. It's incredible, thousands and thousands. And this is another area of the dig site in the southwest corner looking from the north. Dr. Martin was a historian and theologian, author of 9 books, and the books Temple to Jerusalem for God. Now this is quick layout of the city of Jerusalem. The temple, so-called Temple Mount, in quotes, the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It looks better in black and white. Do you need the light to record, or could we dim the lights?
Somebody turned them on.
Pardon?
You turn off one more.
Yeah. Okay. Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Wailing Wall. Here's the Holy Sepulchre. Notice it is to the west of the Temple Mount. Come back to that later. This is the Muslim quarter in this section, the Christian quarter, the Armenian Christian quarter, and the Jewish quarter. The Wailing Wall is, as I said, it's right here. The Ophel Mound and the city of David. Once again, false Temple Mount, as I believe, the Ophel and the city of David. The Ophel is actually part of the city of David, but that's another issue. So, I'll put that in yellow. Ophel and the city of David. This is Dr. Martin's view of the Herodian temple. The temple was enlarged twice. When they came back from Babylon, they rebuilt the temple in the exact same size. During the time of Simon the Hasmonean, they doubled the size of the sanctuary. And Herod doubled the size of the sanctuary again when he did his expansion in, about 25 BC, 30 BC, I don't know. Now, the information that I'm going to go on with from here is developed from Jewish, or biblical and historical sources, mostly Jewish, eyewitness sources, and covering 250 BC to 1577 AD. You've already seen the 1577 statement. So we've looked at Jesus' statement about the temple. Let's move on about the water on the true Temple Mount. We believe that the Gihon Springs is the source of the water for the temple. And yes, it is a powerful siphon spring like Old Faithful without the heat. It literally pumped the water 40 stories up into the temple. And I'm going to show you from biblical sources and from eyewitness or from secular sources that there was a fountain in the temple. And by the way, that the temple required huge quantities of water for the temple activities. There was a spring or a fountain within the temple. The Gihon Spring is the only significant water source within a 5-mile radius. There is no water source and no drainage at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Massive water complex at the Gihon Springs. There are cisterns at the so-called Al-Aqsa Mosque compound at the Temple Mount. But there's just a massive water complex. So let's look at the first one, the water requirements. Aristeas was believed to be a Jewish writer, wrote or lived sometime between 250 BC and maybe 180 BC. It's unclear. But he was an eyewitness. The whole of the floor of the temple sloped down to the appointed places that water may be conveyed to wash away the blood from the sacrifices. As it says, for many thousand beasts are sacrificed on the feast days. Now you have to clear that stuff away. Now they burnt much of the flesh, but the blood and some other parts had to be washed away to prevent disease, for ritual cleanliness, and it must be kept separate from your city water supply, obviously, or there would be a bit of a disease problem. Now, wrong button here. So, now we're going to consider spring or fountain within the temple. You probably may have encountered some of these passages. But now this is not working. Oh, here it is. In Psalm 29, a Davidic psalm, it says, the voice of Yahweh is upon the waters. The God of the Elohim of glory thunders. Yahweh is upon many waters. Yahweh sits upon a flood. Verses 3 and verse 10. Then in Psalm 36, also a Davidic psalm, the first 72 psalms are Davidic, and then there's other ones scattered later. You shall make them, talking about the children of men, drink of the river of your pleasures. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light shall we see light. Jesus talks about that he is the fountain of life. He's talking about the temple. And what is his body? His body is the temple. So is yours. There is a river, Psalm 45 and 46, whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High. The temple is often referred to as tabernacle. Note the streams, plural, because the Gihon was a gushing spring. Like Mount Faithful, it would happen periodically. This has to do with the geology of the karst spring that the Gihon is one. If you look at that video and purchase the video, you'll see a presentation by the hydrologist who explains brilliantly, and it was very easy to make a graphic of his explanation. Psalm 87. God's foundation is in the holy mountain. Glorious things are spoken of you, city of God. All my springs are in you. Psalm 87. Once again, springs plural. For my people, Jeremiah was complaining. He said, for my people have committed two evils. One, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. This is where Jesus got his statement. Hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Here's the background to this statement. The people were so sinful that the water from the Gihon turned brackish. The temple water, I maintain, Dr. Martin maintained, turned brackish. It had to be living water. It had to be clear. It had to be pure. It had to not smell. And brackish, we mean like sour eggs, or, an egg smell that they put in your gas lines. So God, your sacrifices are so polluting, I'm going to pollute your water. And this is why they could not withstand the siege very long. And they started using cistern water, and Jeremiah is saying, you cannot use that. Those cisterns are on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We'll get into that later. Ezekiel 47 verse 1. This verse you're probably familiar with. Afterward he brought me again to the door of the house of the temple in vision from Babylon. Waters issued out from under the threshold of the house eastward, and the waters came down from under the right side of the house at the south side of the altar. This verse 47 is a flashback that Ezekiel is having, and so he was seeing stuff that he had seen in real life as a young prophet. Joel chapter 3 verse 18, prophecy of the future. All the rivers of Judah shall flow with waters, and a fountain shall come forth of the house of Yahweh, and shall water the valley of Shittim. So, you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque platform, the Dome of the Rock, the Haram al-Sharif. There's no streams of water coming out of there. About a dozen or so years ago, they started seeing water appear up here. Yeah, all the rabbis got excited. The Temple Institute, the Temple Mount Faithful, they all got excited. It turned out a pipe had burst. They had to eat their words. So in Dr. Martin's illustration of the Rhodian Temple, we posit that the temple is here, Fort Antonia is here, and the Gihon Spring is down here, encased and protecting the water source of the city and the temple. Now, they ran low on water because there were almost 100,000 people who would come in to Jerusalem during the feast days. It was a big convention town. That's why one of the reasons they couldn't find a room at the inn when Jesus was born, near the Day of Trumpets, which is another book that Dr. Martin's written, 3 BC. And, you know, they were accommodating 8 miles south in Bethlehem. For going to Jerusalem every day, 8 miles is nothing for these people in those days. Back to Aristaeus, in 250 BC. An abundant natural spring gushes up from within the temple area. Oh, this is 6 historical sources for a temple spring. Aristaeus says a natural spring gushes up from within the temple area. He was an eyewitness. He saw that from the temple that was built after the exiles had come back from Babylon. And then this one I found about 2 years ago, 1 Kings 2:39 in the Septuagint. Now this verse is greatly expanded in the Septuagint. This is the Greek version, the Breton translation. Just a portion of it. It goes on for about what we would consider 2 or 3 paragraphs, maybe more. This particular verse, it's not in the King James, it's not in the Hebrew. Solomon made the sea, but the Septuagint was made about, as a matter of fact, Aristaeus tells the story of how the Septuagint was made. So the Septuagint was created and written in Egypt before Aristaeus went to Jerusalem. Solomon made the sea and the bases of the things and the great lavers and the pillars and the fountain of the court. He's talking about the temple here. Whoever wrote this translation and apparently added some stuff. Enoch, which says what his situation was, what he was observing in the 2nd century BC. Enoch wrote, a holy mountain. Under the mountain was water from the east. In other words, the water under the mountain came from the east. It came from the Mount of Olives. And as a matter of fact, most hydrologists believe that the water came from Mount Scopus, north of the Mount of Olives. And somehow from the north, the Mount Tabor and Mount Hermon, the water flows down right here through Mount Scopus, and as Enoch is saying, from the east, and water proceeds from underneath the mountain. Which mountain? The Holy Mountain. He's talking about the temple. The Copper Scroll talks about in the mouth of the fountain of the Bet Shem. Now Bet Shem is used many times to indicate the temple. It means the house of the name. Bet means house and Shem means name. Referring to God's name, meaning the temple. Silver and gold, votive vessels, and silver coins were part of the treasure that were buried, one of several, all over the place, were buried in the mouth of the fountain of the Bet Shem. Okay, the Romans would have found this gold because they took apart every stone from upon another, because this temple was used as a safe deposit box for the Jews in Alexandria and Babylon and all over Anatolia, which is Turkey today, and all over the empire. And it was stored in the temple. It was kind of like a central depository for their treasure. The Roman historian Tacitus, who died in 117, but he wrote after the temple was destroyed, the temple contained an inexhaustible spring. Whether Tacitus had that got this verbiage, this usage from Aristaeus, I don't know. But Tacitus obviously had records from the Roman records. In other words, he wrote that. And the Babylonian Talmud, compiled about in the 300s AD, from older accounts, usually pretty good history. Hence go forth the waters which bubble forth from under the threshold of the sanctuary. Talking about the temple. And actually this is a reference, which we're not going to discuss here, to a passage in Zechariah 14. So now let's look at the Gihon Springs. I only need one slide by George Adam Smith in Jerusalem, Topography, Economics and History. Smith was writing using the data from Wilson and Conrad Schick, a German archaeologist and architect, who had he had access to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque because there was a water problem from the cisterns that needed to be fixed. And they still store water in the cisterns, by the way, or did back in the early 1900s and the 1800s. Wilson Warren and Conrad Schick. And if you go to Jerusalem with Debbie, go to the Christ Church across the street from by the Jaffa Gate, and it's called David's Tower. It has nothing to do with David, but across the street is the chapel, and they have a museum there with a model of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Temple Mount, that Conrad Schick made over, I think, a dozen years. Go see that. It's free. And they'll give you a guided tour, and they know about this, and they reject it. But I love those people. They're really cool. George Adam Smith said, the Gihon Spring is Jerusalem's only supply of fresh water in early antiquity. South of this hill is another minor water source, the Rogel Spring, which is actually just a well. This is, I'm not going to go into it, but the Gihon Spring is its only source. I had Dan Mahat, former chief archaeologist of Jerusalem, tell me that years ago, about 10 years ago. And Ronnie Reich says that. Ask Shukron if you ever visit and take a tour with him. He'll tell you the same thing, Eli Shukron. Back and then forward again. Okay, back again. And I'm going to show you some slides. I need to update these slides of a massive water complex at the Gihon Spring. This is Hezekiah's tunnel. It starts here at the spring and goes down and then goes all the way down to the pool of Siloam. Here's another cross section. It's the same sighting that we saw. Hezekiah's tunnel is at the bottom. There's a modern building here, and the spring is over here on the lower right. And I'm not quite sure how David's men climbed up there, but here's a top-down view. This pool here is very interesting. I'll mention that later if I remember. I am over 65, so this is the latest 2002. I've got to get updates on some of these things because they keep digging down there, keep finding new stuff, new chambers, new rooms. So once again, this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and this is the Gihon Spring. It's nowhere near. Now, there were aqueducts in the Hasmonean period that were dug from Bethlehem and expanded in the time of Pontius Pilate. Jews even had a riot that did connect this piece of territory. Why? Because, as I said, the temple was here, and the Gihon, so much of the water was being used for the sacrifices because of the population explosion in the first century. So they had to bring in extra water, and Pilate wanted to use the temple tax because the temple water took so much, it benefits the people. They had a riot, of course, and this is all in Josephus. Now let's look at Fortress Antonia, the true Fortress Antonia, as described by Josephus. Oh, don't be fickle. Here we go. So we're going to look at Fortress Antonia. Only fortress remained. Remember, we read this earlier. Only the camp of those who destroyed the